Story by Worldly Mushrooms 777. Sleep Paralysis Experiences. A little bit of background. I grew up in a house that was built in the 1960s. Our family moved into the house in the late 2000s. From the start, something was a little off with the house, but it was small things that could be easily explained. With time, things were getting heavier, like TVs turning on and cabinets opening on their own. Around 2017, we started seeing shadows. We would hear someone whisper our name. There was a knocking at the doors and no one was physically there. Anyway, in 2018, one night I was home alone since my family had gone on a trip and I wasn't able to go because of work. I was laying in bed and started experiencing sleep paralysis, something that had never happened to me before and was the only time it ever had so far. While this was happening, I experienced what everyone describes. A dark figure with reddish eyes climbed on top of me and started scratching at me. The weird thing about this sleep paralysis episode was that I also had an out-of-body experience. When the dark figure climbed on top of me, I was able to get it off and get out of bed. I started walking towards my door, but I felt like I was attached to something, like stretching out of it, my physical body. I reached the door and grabbed the knob, trying to open the door, but this black figure wouldn't let me. As I struggled, all of a sudden I snapped out of it and woke up in bed. Guys, I could still physically feel the sensation of the doorknob on my hand when I jumped up in bed. It doesn't end there, though. My room was somewhat dark. Some light still came in through the window. As I sat there panicking, completely awake, this dark figure was standing at the door of my walk-in closet, just looking at me. My first thought was that I was still dreaming, but as I sat there, it completely vanished. When it disappeared, I started hearing rattling in the kitchen and the chairs at the dining table being dragged around. It was the most bizarre thing. That experience left me spiritually weak. Like after that, any little thing scares me really bad to the point I start having a panic attack. Thankfully, later that year we moved out of the home. Living in another home made me realize there was so much activity there that we grew up to accept as normal, but nothing like it happens in this new home. Story by Vashtistraeth. 2 years ago, I would have sleep paralysis so often that I was terrified to even try to sleep. If you're not familiar with what sleep paralysis is, it is a phenomenon in which a person, either during falling asleep or awakening, temporarily experiences an inability to move, speak, or react, accompanied by a feeling of pressure on one's chest and difficulty breathing. It is also accompanied by unusually powerful and terrifying hallucinations, to which one is unable to react due to paralysis. The first hallucination I remember having while undergoing sleep paralysis was it felt like something was dragging its claws down my left arm. I had fallen asleep on my back on the couch in the living room, and I remember opening my eyes a few hours later, but I couldn't move a muscle, and it felt as if I was suffocating. I could feel these claws dragging down my arm, but I couldn't scream. No sound would come out. I felt terrified and felt as if something was watching me. I had a dreadful feeling that I would die, and no one would help me. After I had control of my body again, I sat straight up and began to cry, and had to call one of my friends to talk to her to maybe keep my mind off the horrible situation. Most of my experiences with sleep paralysis did not come with the hallucinations. They mainly involved the basic symptoms of not being able to move my body, not being able to speak, and feeling as if I couldn't breathe. This next experience I had was the most terrifying. My parents have a really comfortable memory foam bed, and my dad was working and my mom was in another room, so I figured I'd take a quick nap in there. I had done so much research on sleep paralysis after having to suffer with it for ages, and I made a note that most of my experiences happened when I slept on my back, so this time I slept on my stomach. I started to have the feeling of not being able to move, breathe, or speak, and I knew the dreaded sleep paralysis was happening again. This time, I felt someone shaking me, trying to wake me up, and I heard my mother's voice say, "Baby, it's time to wake up." I still couldn't move, so I tried to wiggle my toes and my fingers, hoping to wake my body up. Once I could move, I decided that I was not going to go back to sleep, and I went to the living room. Guess what I saw in there? Not even a few minutes after regaining the ability to move. My mother was asleep on the couch. Story by Karmakastitarikaarii. What exactly did I encounter during my sleep paralysis episodes? Hello, Sleep Paralysis Stories community. I have recently become very interested in the topic of sleep paralysis and am in need of answers. I am well acquainted with the psychological aspect of the events that took place, but find myself in need of answers to the particular entities I've encountered, as well as what they symbolize. I have been absolutely terrified to touch on this topic until I resolved the underlying personal stress that seemed to cause issues I had with sleep paralysis. Since any time I brought it up, my thoughts would stray and it would often trigger a paralysis episode the same night or a bout of anxiety that inevitably ended in this happening to me. I don't need an explanation for the hallucinations. I'm just curious if anyone has documented the entities from my stories and would be kind enough to tell me who they are, or at least point me to a source of information. I'll be splitting my darkest encounters into parts, as I would like to get this off my chest once and for all. Part 1. The first time anything occurred to me was when I first returned from college. I was under a lot of stress and fell asleep deep in the night, as I was preparing for an upcoming exam and ended up waking to someone embracing me from behind. I wanted to move my arms to see who it was, but the embrace felt so tight I could only move my eyes around the room and saw a leg sitting on the blanket I had over my body. I also heard what sounded like gentle breathing, the kind that you would hear if someone embraced you and then fell asleep before you did. This terrified me, as I remembered I was home alone. I immediately started shaking and trying so damn hard to scream and move either my right arm or leg, basically anything at all, so I could scream and hopefully overpower this intruder. But while I was doing so, I just happened to wake them up. Whatever that thing was let out a guttural growl and reached over me with what looked like a gray, oversized claw and bit into my neck so hard it woke me up. I called my grandmother immediately after and decided to spend a full week there, missing my exam in the process as I was utterly shitting myself at the very concept of being alone with this thing. Part 2. The second time I had sleep paralysis, I was in the college dorm. I'll note for the purpose of this part in particular that the dorm was connected with a state school for children with hearing disabilities, and they would sometimes be very loud, meaning that in spite of the school's placement on the main floor of the building, you could hear them through the entire dorm. I woke up at about 9 in the morning, and the sun was shining at the wall next to my bed, which I was turned towards, my back to the door of my room. I immediately knew something was wrong when I couldn't hear birds chirping outside my window, where they had been nesting since spring began. Suddenly, I started hearing the screaming of the children from downstairs, but amid all the commotion on the main floor I heard it again, the growling noise, this time accompanied by loud, dull footsteps coming down the hall, ever closer to my dorm room. When it got to the door, it started scratching at the door so loud, like someone was dragging metal keys over my door. This freaked me out so bad, I ended up kicking the bed frame and waking up my neighbor, who came to check on me almost immediately after. Part 3. The final time I had a bad bout of paralysis was in May 2023 at my girlfriend's home. We spent most of that week outdoors and decided to have a day home as my allergies were getting the better of me and I really needed some rest. It was about 1 p.m., after a nice meal and some Netflix binging, that I decided to go nap after a full night of waking up nearly constantly. Feeling some sense of accomplishment since I finally spent a whole day walking and exploring, I laid on my back, put my hands under my head and dozed off into a good dream. This is a very funny one because I seriously remember it was in this dream, in a skyscraper I had never seen before, that I entered a room that looked exactly like my girl's. It was in that moment that a woman in my dream turned to me and said, "They're coming, hide quickly." The moment she said that, I heard footsteps again, woke up and noticed two things. One, I felt my hands were locked together, not behind but above my head. Two, there was a shadow with deep red eyes at the foot of the bed, floating, reaching toward my legs with long black fingers. I immediately tried to scream as loud as I could, but my vocal cords would only allow me to wheeze. The footsteps were getting louder and louder again, walking up the steps to outside of the closed door. As the growls and the scratching at the door began once again, the shadow finally touched my left leg. Its touch was cold, so cold it woke my leg and I kicked it, which woke me from the episode. My hands were indeed locked above my head, and I found it hard to pull them apart. In that moment, my girl came into the room, and I started crying because it terrified me so bad. I felt so down that day. The best way to explain it is the feeling you get when a fever finally subsides, and all of your bones end up hurting. Conclusion: I like to keep a clear mind, so I am writing here in order to vent and hopefully get my questions answered. I am still terrified at the thought that this might happen to me again, but it has been much calmer since last year. I do understand these episodes of sleep paralysis were deeply connected to my fractured mental state at the time, but I'd like to inquire if anyone knows more on the topic of these two entities. 1. The growling woman. 2. The red-eyed shadow. Thank you in advance for any useful information you might provide me with.